The talk that I'll be reading for you today is largely about Vertov in a broader context and meant to kind of situate these objects within Vertov's career and the broader sort of cinema industry of Russia at the time. Dziga Vertov, the charismatic, dynamic filmmaker of the early Soviet era, embodied the extreme of the cinematic avant-garde of the period. Vertov's theoretical and practical oeuvre of the 1920s and 30s expressed the potential for film and its technical procedures to construct a visual reality for the new Soviet Russia. During the late teens and early 1920s, Vertov modeled his experimental filmmaking on industrial production and emphasized the agency of film to serve an ideological purpose in the new communist state and its potential to construct the vision of the new man. Vertov seized the relatively new medium of film as an industrial art made through cutting-edge technological machines and materials. The reproducibility of film provided a clear means to reach the largely illiterate masses and to work in a truly classless art form. Vertov was committed to documentary film as opposed to fictional cinema based on clear narrative or linear montage. His relatively brief career would prove itself to be tumultuous. The 1920s saw an artistic boom from Vertov, in which his newsreels and feature films reflected the experimental, complex nature of the theory he simultaneously published. By the late 1920s, however, and particularly by the early 1930s, Vertov experienced increasing roadblocks and problems when interacting with the bureaucracy of the Soviet film industry. I'll speak this evening, perhaps for not too long, about the ways in which the objects shown here tie into this dynamic career, Vertov's specific working methods, and the exciting time of the 20s, as well as how the objects reveal details about the struggles that Vertov most certainly encountered. Vertov, born Denis Arkadyevich Kaufman in 1896, was the son of Jewish intellectuals in the Russian territory of Bialystok. He studied music and sound at the Regional Conservatory until fleeing to Moscow with his parents in 1914 to evade the German army. Vertov's entrance into film was through his initial education in music. He began experimenting with verbal montage structures and editing sound recordings of everyday noises taken from the street. Much like his contemporaries, who make up the first generation of early Soviet filmmakers, for example, Lev Kuleshov, Vsevolod Pudovkin, or Sergei Eisenstein, Vertov's early training was in a field other than cinema, as a true film school had yet to emerge. Vertov's interest in documentary recording blossomed when he joined the People's Commissariat of Public Education's Film Committee in 1918. Through his work there, he began editing Kino-Nedelya, or Film Week, the government's first newsreel program. There are 43 Kino-Nedelyas of approximately 10 to 20-minute segments of news. These would be filmed surrounding one event or theme, such as the erection of a monument or a parade celebrating the revolution or its leaders. None of the footage of Kino-Nedelya is staged or acted. Rather, the project gathered news fragments to be shown in cinemas for the masses to hear and to learn about public government events. Kino-Nedelya was not a project launched or headed by Vertov, but rather an existing entity with which he would work as editor, and the concepts and ideas of which would expand into his own later projects, such as his Kino Pravda series. The object on display here from 1919 is likely not Vertov's first certificate for cinematic filming of war events, as he had already begun doing so in 1918. The certificate allows Vertov the right to possess cinematographic equipment to aid his coverage of war events. It reads, "The bearer of this, Comrade Vertov Denis Arkadyevich, is the actual leader of the cinematographic shooting of all war events of the Revolutionary War Council of the Southeastern Front. He has permission to carry and safekeep with him relevant instruments certified by these signatures and stamp." On the back, handwritten in pen and pencil, are notes referencing places and instructions for photographic shooting, theoretically written by Vertov. Perhaps this reflects how seriously Vertov took such documentation. He may have kept it with him at all times, but he also used it as scrap paper when necessary. It was while working with the People's Commissariat that Vertov met and began working with his future wife and creative collaborator, Elizaveta Svilova, who had been learning the cleaning and preservation of film. Svilova would appear throughout Vertov's work, physically editing film strips and images together as a documentary and pedagogical tactic to demonstrate within the movie itself how film is made. At approximately the same time, he changed his name from his original Denis Kaufman to Dziga Vertov. He chose Vertov because it is derived from the verb meaning to spin, as a film camera or projector would. Dziga is not a Russian name. He chose it because he believed that the word in repetition sounded like the spinning of a film wheel or projector. Dziga, 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 dziga. By 1922, Vertov and his wife had gathered a following of young filmmakers. The group called itself the Kinocs, and with Vertov as their charismatic leader, they published an enormous amount of film theory. Much of these early writings serve as a basis of the syllabi of any introductory film history course, Russian, Western, or otherwise, and these theories stand today as having laid out the groundwork, the rules and parameters of documentary film. His array of film theories were part of a wide understanding of film known as Kino-Eye, or Kino-Glas, which is also the name of one of his feature-length movies. Throughout Kino-Eye, Vertov stressed the need for cinema to distinguish itself from the bourgeois habits of theater, romantic narrative, and mimetic representation. His films were, at their core, about film. He saw every element of filmmaking as part of the process of editing, meaning the choice of what to film is a part of editing as much as physically cutting the reel is. The film fragments are bricks for Vertov to build, and his tool for building was the cinematic apparatus, the lens that would supersede the eye and see what the human cannot. Vertov, more than any other director, was entirely committed to the cause of film and its function in post-revolutionary Soviet society as a didactic tool and a means with which to build a new manner of vision, or perhaps to visualize the new man. The concept of film fragments as bricks in some ways served as a solution to the problem of shortage of film stock. Filmmakers of the early Soviet era in general were faced with extreme lack of stock footage, and in divergent ways they took on various means to deal with this problem. Kuleshov, for example, similarly to Vertov, chose a specific means of montage in which the length of each shot was quite short, with a relatively vague image presented in each shot. The linking together of these shots would produce meaning, rather than the narrative of one lengthy shot conveying action. Vertov would work similarly, reusing fragments gathered at various moments in his newsreels and his feature-length films. The postcard featured here of a film still from Kino-Glas may be a highly edited still from a film fragment used in Kino-Glas or perhaps in Man with the Movie Camera. From 1922 to 1924, the Kinocs group produced Kino Pravda, or Film Truth, an extended and more ambitious project of newsreel than Kino Nedelia, and this time Vertov was in complete control of the undertaking. Kino Pravda presented documentary fragments of everyday experiences of the working class, including time spent in bars, markets, schools, and in factories. Remember that Vertov was insistent on documentary film with no actors. In the early 1920s, walking around the streets of Moscow with a working film camera was not an ordinary activity, and Vertov maneuvered the uneasy task of making people stop looking directly at him or the camera, and began using hidden cameras to avoid such issues. He and his cameraman, Mikhail Kaufman, who was also his brother, took to extreme measures to get their necessary shots. His paradigmatic film, from 1929, The Man with the Movie Camera, was named the 8th best movie ever made by the British Film Institute's Sight and Sound magazine in 2012. It stands as a culmination of his complex theories that had developed since the late teens. The plot of such a militant nonfiction film is difficult to pinpoint, though the film does follow a clear structure. We see a cameraman's actions as he moves through a day in an urban setting, with breaks and cutaways to machines and factory workers, as well as the process of filmmaking itself. There is very little geographic continuity. Sequences were filmed in Moscow, Odessa, and Kiev, and images are repeated in various juxtaposition. The film includes images and sequences that convey elements of life: marriage, divorce, birth, death, work, rest, and play. The seemingly mundane activities of ordinary workers become symbolic of a new order of film and of Soviet society. Many segments of the film utilize superimposition or extremely manipulated film spools for either metaphor or to teach the masses about the possibilities of film. One of the clearest and longest threads through the movie is the theme of awakening. The first third of the movie presents a city waking up, juxtaposed with a woman completing her morning routine. We see direct metaphor through the woman's toilette and the literal washing of the city. This metaphor is quite an obvious juxtaposition, though it is indicative of a technique Vertov uses throughout Man with the Movie Camera. He shows us multiple images of the streets and of the woman awakening to ensure retrospective meaning. The idea of purging or cleaning is weighted throughout Vertov's work, both in relation to a purge of traditional or narrative theater and film, as well as the purges of the New Order in favor of communist life. Immediately following the washing scene, the lens literally changes in and out of focus, while flowers appear cleared and blurred. The lens shifts into focus and the flowers become clear, creating an instant understanding of how the physical apparatus works. This short transition is an example of Vertov showing off the camera's abilities to construct a new manner of sight. This type of pedagogical demonstration appears again when Vertov creates a representation of film itself. Elizaveta Svilova appears editing film segments directly followed by the images she cuts in order to show a Soviet viewer exactly what film is and what it can do. Throughout Man with the Movie Camera, images link film to Soviet industrial production. Vertov was extremely outspoken about the ineffectiveness and disorganization of the government's film production and distribution company. He openly voiced his frustration with the agency's lack of funding, regularization, or organized method of production. He published internationally, for example in Cahiers du Cinéma, and quite possibly spoke about the need to improve Soviet filmmaking during his public talks in Western Europe. The flyers and posters on display reflect an interest in Germany, which existed in France, Holland, and growing numbers of cities in Western Europe, into the work of Vertov. Soviet film was circulated abroad to some extent to present the West what Russia was capable of artistically under a communist regime. Vertov's work was not sent abroad with any regularity, but often through secret channels and makeshift theaters in the basements of interested critics abroad. The modernist aesthetic with which the postcards and advertisements for Vertov's events reflects the public which would attend such evenings. Vertov's public action later got him into trouble, and beginning in the late 1920s, he was granted fewer and fewer projects outside of short, badly circulated newsreels. Decades following his death, his work would have a renaissance in the French Nouvelle Vague movement, and his influence can be seen in the work of Courtauld, Truffaut, and countless filmmakers today. During the early 1930s, however, Vertov and his cohort of first-generation filmmakers experienced dramatic changes to an already problematic cinema industry. Kino, set up in 1924, a national state-run cinema industry, which took over the existent Goskino, the first film company based largely in Moscow. Kino was a relatively stable industry and oversaw positive and ever-increasing statistics of cinematic output in Russia from 1924 to 1928. During these years, more cinemas were built each year and more domestic films were completed. Funding was problematic, and Sovkina set impossibly high projections for the quantity of Soviet production. However, under Sovkino, the golden age of Soviet film found its short-lived footing and produced avant-garde, energetic, and experimental films. In 1924, a new action group was formed entitled ARC, the Association of Revolutionary Cinematographers, ARK, set up to ensure that the party paid sufficient attention to domestically produced, purely Soviet cinema. It was formed largely as a response to the growing popularity of foreign films from France and the US as the masses preferred comedies and cowboy westerns. ARK included Vertov, Purovkin, Eisenstein, Kuleshov, and other quintessential directors of the first generation. ARK published several journals in which the debates surrounding the use and importance of film were discussed, and in which this dynamic group argued against each other in a surge of intellectual and creative thought. ARK also functioned as a means by which to speak out against the leadership of Sovkino for its dependence on commercial or foreign films and its problematic funding schemes. In 1930, however, Sovkino was turned into Soyuz Kino, a larger, centralized authority over the film industry, with new leadership and increasingly tighter reins. When he spoke out against Stalin's point of view, Soyuz Kino's first leader, Mikhail Rutin, was executed. His replacement, Boris Shumatsky, had never trained or worked in cinema and ran Soyuz Kino with an iron fist, with no positive thought toward the first generation of Soviet avant-garde filmmakers. Under Soyuz Kino, ARK was transformed into ARRK, the Association of Revolutionary Workers of Cinematography, which would stress the proletarian credentials of the organization. ARK was frequently purged and accused of being bourgeois with their intellectually elite members in films. Arc was to call for a proletariat film industry which reached the masses through simple narrative and only for political gain. Formalism and experimentation were wiped away with Arc. The importance for these objects of this story, then, is the details of Vertov's Arc membership booklet. Vertov had each month stamped to confirm his membership up until 1930, and although he filled out in pen the year 1931, the page is empty with no stamps, meaning his tenure with Arc had ended. I'll conclude with Vertov's most personal objects, and my favorite. His fountain pen and watch remind us of Vertov as the man. Though his films are known on a global scale today, his production in the 1920s was quite intimate, with his wife working as his editor, his brother as his cameraman, and his pupils working as non-actors in his films. He frequently worked with Verchenko for his domestic film posters and retained personal friendships with those he worked with professionally. Although it would take decades for Vertov's work to receive the intellectual analysis it deserved, his legacy would influence filmmaking theory and practice in the West throughout the later half of the 20th century through to today. Thank you.